One point in your life you realize that not only is that something you've been there, done that, but you want to reach out to other things and blowing people away.
The lights dimmed in the small theater. The audience fell silent. And then Clint Eastwood, the man who defined masculinity for generations, stood before the camera and delivered words that no one expected to hear. His voice, weathered by time but still commanding, carried a message that would shake Hollywood to its core. This wasn't a movie role. This wasn't a scripted performance. This was Clint Eastwood at 94 years old, speaking his truth for what many believe could be the final time. And what he revealed about legacy, regret, and the cost of being a legend will change everything you thought you knew about the man with no name for over 6 decades. Clint Eastwood has been America's ultimate cowboy, the squinting gunslinger, the rogue cop who made his own rules, the director who turned violence into poetry and silence into power. We've watched him transform from a struggling television actor into an Academy Award-winning filmmaker whose influence shaped modern cinema. But behind those steely eyes and that granite jaw lies a story far more complex than any character he ever played. A story of broken families, of children who felt abandoned, of women who loved him and lost themselves in the process, of choices that haunted him across decades. Now, as Clint enters what he himself calls the final chapter, he's doing something he's never done before. He's opening up. He's looking back without the filter of toughness that defined his image. He's admitting mistakes. He's naming regrets. He's delivering a message to the world that comes from a place of hard-earned wisdom and painful reflection. At 94 years old, Clint Eastwood is finally ready to tell the complete truth. And it's more emotional than anyone could have imagined. Clinton Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, California, during the darkest days of the Great Depression. His father, Clinton Sr., worked odd jobs wherever he could find them, moving the family constantly as economic desperation gripped America. His mother, Margaret Ruth Runner, held the family together through sheer determination, teaching young Clint that survival meant adaptability and silence meant strength. They never stayed anywhere long enough for Clint to form lasting friendships. He learned early that people leave, that nothing is permanent, that depending on others only leads to disappointment. The Eastwood family bounced from town to town along the West Coast: Oakland, Sacramento, Pacific, Palisades, Redding, Piedmont. Each move meant a new school, new faces, new attempts to fit in. Clint was tall for his age, lanky and awkward, the kind of kid who faded into the background. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't a star student. He was just there, observing, learning that the world didn't owe him anything, and that if he wanted something, he'd have to take it himself. Music became his first love. Clint taught himself piano, spending hours alone working through jazz standards and blues progressions. The piano didn't judge him. It didn't leave. It was constant in a childhood defined by constant change. He dreamed of becoming a musician, imagining himself in smoky clubs playing for audiences who understood the language of melody and silence. But dreams were luxuries in the Eastwood household. Survival was the priority. After barely graduating from Oakland Technical High School in 1948, Clint drifted. He worked as a lifeguard. He chopped lumber in Oregon. He fought forest fires. He loaded trucks. Each job was temporary, each paycheck barely enough. In 1950, the Korean War was raging, and Clint was drafted into the United States Army. He was stationed at Fort Ord, California, assigned as a swimming instructor and projectionist. It wasn't combat, but it was structure. It was routine. And during those military years, Clint started thinking seriously about acting. A fellow soldier had connections in Hollywood. He told Clint he had the look, the height, the presence, that Hollywood was always searching for the next leading man. After his discharge in 1953, Clint headed to Los Angeles with nothing but a duffel bag and unrealistic optimism. He enrolled in acting classes at Los Angeles City College. He took the rounds of auditions, facing rejection after rejection. Casting directors told him he was too stiff. His voice was too soft. He moved like a cowboy but sounded like a kid. Universal Pictures offered him a contract in 1954, paying him $75 a week. It felt like winning the lottery. It was actually just the beginning of years of humiliation. Universal put Clint in forgettable B-movies with titles like Revenge of the Creature, Tarantula, and Francis in the Navy. He had maybe 2 lines per film. He stood in the background looking tall. The studio system chewed up young actors and spit them out. And Clint was just another piece of meat waiting to be discarded. By 1955, Universal dropped his contract. He was unemployed again, questioning everything, wondering if the soldier who told him he could make it in Hollywood had been lying, or just delusional. Then came 1958. Clint auditioned for a new Western television series called Rawhide. He read for the part of Rowdy Yates, a young trail hand working cattle drives across the Old West. The producers weren't impressed initially. Clint was too quiet, too internal, but there was something about him, a quality the camera loved even if the human eye didn't immediately notice it. They gave him the role. Rawhide premiered in January 1959, and Clint Eastwood suddenly had steady work. For 8 seasons and over 100 episodes, he rode across television screens as Rowdy Yates, learning his craft, studying the camera, understanding how less could be more. But television made you famous, not legendary. Clint knew that movies were where careers were built. In 1964, during a hiatus from Rawhide, an Italian director named Sergio Leone offered Clint the lead role in a low-budget Western, being shot in Spain. The pay was laughable, $15,000. The script was weird, barely any dialogue. Everyone in Hollywood told Clint to turn it down. European Westerns were jokes. It would kill his career. Clint ignored them all and flew to Spain. A Fistful of Dollars premiered in 1964 and changed cinema forever. Clint played the man with no name, a mysterious gunslinger who spoke in grunts and killed without remorse. The film was violent, stylized, operatic. It made over $14 million worldwide, astronomical for a European Western. Suddenly, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a television actor. He was an international phenomenon. Leone quickly made 2 sequels, for a few dollars more in 1965 and The Good, The Bad, and The Ugly in 1966. The Dollars trilogy turned Clint into a global superstar and redefined the Western genre forever. Hollywood couldn't ignore him anymore. Clint returned to America as a movie star, commanding real money and real respect. In 1968, he starred in Coogan's Bluff, marking his first collaboration with director Don Siegel. Then came Where Eagles Dare and Paint Your Wagon, both massive hits. But 1971 brought Dirty Harry, and nothing was ever the same again. As Inspector Harry Callahan, Clint delivered the most iconic line in cinema history, "Do you feel lucky, punk?" Dirty Harry became a cultural lightning rod, praised by some as a masterpiece of urban crime cinema, condemned by others as fascist propaganda. Clint didn't care about the controversy. The film made over $36 million and spawned for sequels. Throughout the 1970s, Clint dominated. He made The Outlaw Josie Wales, The Enforcer, Every Which Way But Loose, and Escape from Alcatraz. He founded his own production company, Malpaso Productions, ensuring creative control over his projects. In 1971, Clint made his directorial debut with Play Misty for Me, a psychological thriller that proved he understood filmmaking from both sides of the camera. Critics were stunned. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a movie star. He was a serious filmmaker. The 1980s and 1990s saw Clint evolve even further. He directed and starred in Pale Rider, Heartbreak Ridge, and the masterpiece Unforgiven. Released in 1992, Unforgiven deconstructed the Western mythology Clint himself had built. It won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Clint Eastwood, the man who barely graduated high school, stood on the Oscar stage holding Hollywood's highest honor. He was 62 years old, an age when most actors retire. Clint was just getting started. Million Dollar Baby in 2004 won for more Oscars. Gran Torino in 2008 became a cultural phenomenon. American Sniper in 2014 broke box office records. Clint kept directing into his 80s, releasing The Mule at 88 and Cry Macho at 91. He became the oldest person to direct a major Hollywood film. The legend kept growing. But behind the scenes, the cost of that legend was devastating. Clint Eastwood's personal life reads like a casualties list from one of his war movies. He's been married twice, officially. But the reality is far messier. There were overlapping relationships, secret affairs, children born to different women, sometimes in the same year. For decades, Clint lived by the cowboy code he portrayed on screen, moving from woman to woman, never truly settling, always keeping part of himself locked away where no one could reach it. His first marriage to Maggie Johnson in 1953 should have been a foundation. Instead, it became a casualty of his rising fame. While married to Maggie, Clint had an affair with stuntwoman Roxanne Tunis that lasted 14 years and produced a daughter, Kimber, born in 1964. Maggie didn't know about Kimber for years. The betrayal cut deep, but she stayed, trying to hold together a marriage that was already shattered. They had 2 children together, Kyle and Allison, who grew up watching their father disappear for months at a time, chasing the next film, the next conquest, the next anything that wasn't home. Then came Sandra Locke. They met on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1975. The chemistry was instant and destructive. Sandra moved in with Clint while he was still married to Maggie. The relationship lasted 13 years, during which they made 6 films together. But Clint was still having affairs, still disappearing, still keeping secrets. In 1986, while living with Sandra, Clint started a relationship with flight attendant Jacelyn Reeves. She gave him 2 children, Scott and Catherine, both born while Clint was supposedly committed to Sandra. When Sandra discovered the betrayal, the relationship exploded. She sued Clint for palimony in 1989, claiming he'd sabotaged her career and ruined her life. The lawsuit was vicious and public, revealing the ugliest parts of Clint's private behavior. He'd allegedly forced Sandra to have 2 abortions. He'd controlled her career. He'd promised her things he never intended to deliver. They settled out of court, but the damage was done. America's stoic hero was exposed as something far less heroic in his private life. Clint's relationship with his children became another source of pain. Some barely knew him. Others felt abandoned, watching their father on movie screens while he missed their birthdays and graduations. His daughter Kimber once said in an interview that she felt like a secret, someone her father acknowledged but never truly claimed. The wounds ran deep across the entire family, all because Clint couldn't or wouldn't break character. The man with no name extended into his real life, leaving emotional wreckage everywhere he went. His second marriage to Dina Ruiz in 1996 seemed like a fresh start. She was 35 years younger, a television news anchor who seemed to soften him. They had a daughter, Morgan, in 1996. For a while, it looked like Clint had finally found peace. But old patterns die hard. By 2012, Dina filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The truth was simpler. Clint was still emotionally unavailable, still distant, still the cowboy who couldn't settle down even when he desperately wanted to. Health scares started mounting as Clint entered his 80s. There were rumors of heart issues, of treatments kept private, of a man who'd lived invincibly for so long suddenly facing mortality. Friends noticed he moved slower, spoke more carefully, seemed to be calculating something in his mind that the rest of the world couldn't see. The final chapter was approaching, and Clint Eastwood knew it. The 2012 Republican National Convention became another controversy. Clint's bizarre conversation with an empty chair representing President Obama confused audiences and damaged his reputation. Critics called it embarrassing, sad, evidence that age had diminished the legendary director. Clint defended the appearance, but you could see something in his eyes, a recognition that maybe he'd miscalculated, that maybe the world had moved on from the tough guy politics he represented. The final message came during a rare interview in late 2024. Clint sat in his home in Carmel by the Sea, the California town where he'd once served as mayor. At 94, his face carried every year, every choice, every regret. The interviewer asked him about legacy, about what he wanted to be remembered for. And Clint Eastwood, who built a career on silence and stoicism, finally opened up in a way he never had before. He admitted that his greatest failure wasn't a film that flopped or a role he turned down. It was his failure as a father and partner. He named it explicitly, without the usual Hollywood deflection or excuse-making. Clint said that he'd sacrificed his family on the altar of his career and his ego, that he'd convinced himself that providing financially was the same as being present, that he'd hidden behind the mythology of the strong, silent type when the reality was, he was just afraid of intimacy and vulnerability. Clint spoke about his children with tears in his eyes, something no one had ever witnessed publicly. He talked about wanting to apologize to each of them, about understanding now that you can't make movies about redemption while refusing to seek it in your own life. He mentioned specific moments he missed: birthdays, first days of school, weddings, the accumulation of absence that adds up to a relationship that never quite forms. He also addressed Sandra Locke, who passed away in 2018. Clint admitted he'd treated her terribly, that the lawsuit was justified, that he'd used his power in the industry to control her in ways that were wrong. This wasn't a legal admission. This was a moral one. A man at the end of his life trying to face the truth about who he'd been when the truth was ugly and unflattering. But the most emotional part of Clint's final message was about time. He talked about how we all think we have more of it than we do, how we postpone the important conversations and the meaningful gestures because we assume there will always be tomorrow. Clint said his biggest regret was not understanding that legacy isn't the films you make or the awards you win. Legacy is whether the people who knew you feel loved by you. And by that measure, he admitted, he'd failed more than he'd succeeded. Clint is still working, still directing, still refusing to fully retire. But there's a different quality to him now, a softness beneath the granite exterior. He's been reaching out to his children, trying to build bridges that should have been built decades ago. Some have responded with forgiveness. Others are still processing. But the effort itself is what matters. The cowboy is finally trying to come home. Clint Eastwood's final message to the world isn't delivered from a movie screen. It's delivered from a place of brutal self-honesty that took over 9 decades to reach. The lesson is devastatingly simple. Success means nothing if you're alone at the end. Fame can't hold your hand when you're scared. Money can't tell you it loves you. All the things we chase, all the things we sacrifice our relationships for, turn to dust while the people we neglected are the only things that ever really mattered. Clint spent his life playing men who needed nothing and no one. The irony is that the real man behind those roles needed connection desperately and didn't know how to reach for it. Now, in his final chapter, he's trying to teach us what he learned too late. Don't make his mistakes. Don't confuse strength with emotional isolation. Don't assume the people you love will wait forever. While you chase success or pride or whatever story, you're telling yourself about why you can't be vulnerable right now. What's your favorite Clint Eastwood film? Which character defined your understanding of his work? Share your memories in the comments below, and let's celebrate the complicated legacy of a complicated man. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because next week we're revealing the final confession of another Hollywood legend that will leave you speechless. Clint Eastwood once said a man's got to know his limitations. After 94 years, he finally knows his. The question is, do we know ours before it's too late?